Hi everyone and welcome. I am joined today by Jacques Baud, a former colonel and military analyst in the Swiss Army, and may I add also an absolutely prolific author. So it's very good to have you back on the program.
Thank you very much for having me back in your show. Thank you.
So I guess in my opinion, though, what really stands out these days as a key challenge to Europe, if not the key challenge, is the lack of strategic direction, especially at this critical time, because, well, for decades, I think our strategic thinking was largely outsourced to the United States. And it's been clear ever since the Obama administration announcing the pivot to Asia that the world was becoming, more multipolar and the US objectives and priorities were shifting. It also became apparent that the political West would likely have less and less in common. So uh, I think there was always somewhat of a recognition that Europe had to begin to chart its own path. But instead of reviving our strategic thinking, I've seen a lot of wishful thinking, demonization of adversaries, and of course, very emotional rhetoric. How do you how do you assess this Europe's point in history now? What are our main challenges, and how are they being dealt with?
There are different aspects in your question. First of all, as you rightly pointed out, uh, not just Europe, but the West has no strategy. We see that also with the US. They may have some objectives, but I'm not sure they have the adequate strategies to reach those objectives. A strategy is nothing else that a way to achieve your objectives. And in Europe, there is no strategy, but there are no objectives either. And that probably can be explained by the fact that, and we see that very clearly with the Ukraine crisis, but also, I would say, with the Palestine situation, Iran, China, we don't see exactly where the Europeans are heading to. We don't know how they want to proceed, but we don't know neither where they want to go. And that's, I think, it's the problem. And one of the explanation for that is that in Europe, especially, we have still we are not sure exactly who is in charge of foreign policy. We see that very clearly with the Ukraine case. Who should be in charge? Is that the European Union or is that individual countries? When we talk about those, the London talks or whatever talk with Witkoff or Keith Kellogg or whoever, we don't really know. I mean, and view from the US point of view, with whom should they talk? Should they talk to Macron? Not even his foreign minister, by the way, but Macron himself, or Giorgia Meloni, or Merz, but we, but certainly not Kaya Kallas, for instance. So we see that although the European Union claims to be a supranational entity that gathers all the European countries and want this unity and want now a defense policy and so on and so forth, we don't see exactly a clear, let's say, explanation of what they want to achieve, who is in charge, who should, a security policy. If we talk about international security, which is my specialty, the security policy is always based on two pillars, two main pillars, I would say. One is the foreign policy, the other one is the defense policy. For years, the defense policy was, in fact, or was resting on NATO. That was the defense policy of the European Union. And by the way, that is what is written in the EU documents. So no mystery there. But at least the European Union had this foreign policy pillar, at least it was supposed to be. Now, since the beginning of the war in Ukraine, we have seen this European foreign policy totally collapsing. It has focused exclusively on how to weaken Russia, not even in how to strengthen Ukraine, by the way, despite delivery and supply of weapons and ammunition. But we see that in the long run, this is not strengthening Ukraine. And in fact, Ukraine, as we see it today, is weaker than it used to be. So we see that the European Union never managed to have a diplomacy that helps to strengthen not only the economy and what a state needs to live, but also the position of Ukraine in the world. And we can see that now Ukraine, in this relationship with the rest of the world, has has lost, in fact, its status. It's only supported by the West. That's it. But for the rest of the world, Ukraine is not relevant. So we have those two pillars of defense policy, foreign policy, which are not functioning. In fact, they are dysfunctional, and that has always that's in addition that's worsened with Kaya Kallas, because she comes from a country whose culture is nothing else than just adverse to Russia. Period. That's that for them, that's the name of the game. Period. And and we see that she's unable to address other topics um, than Russia. But but for Europe, who claims to be a main actor in the world, and it in essentially it is, because it's a huge market, it's a huge industrial capacity. I mean, it's an important actor in the world, but the European Union has never managed to enhance this role, to enhance the capabilities of Europe and its capacities, especially on the international scene. On the contrary, because it focused on Russia and cutting all ties with Russia, it has contributed to weaken the position of Europe. So, and okay, that's what we can observe. But what we can see is, why is that so? Because, and my explanation is that they never set an objective for Europe. They never set an objective what they want to be in. But you have currently, if you look at the world, you have, would say, three or five main actors, if you want. You have the US, you have China, obviously, you have Europe, you have Russia, and you have the rest of the world. Probably India, we can discuss that. But these are the main actors. When I say rest of the world, namely, in essence, I mean the BRICS, or these are the main actors. Now, what is the position of Europe in this constellation? For the US, it's clear. They want to be the first ones. They want to be the biggest ones. They want to be as they used to be in the second half of the 20th century. They want to be the leading nation in that. This has not changed. The way to address that, the way to achieve that, has probably changed with Donald Trump. But in essence, there is still this sense of, you may call it hegemony, you can call it supremacy, there are different words to qualify this. But in essence, this is that. China is the major contender, and it has not political ambitions as regard of the world, but it has certainly commercial and trade ambitions. And that's why it started to develop its network of road and belt initiatives and all that, which actually has given China an edge and helped China to connect with the rest of the world. Now, Europe in that, Russia is, I would say, it's probably unfair to say it's an emerging power, but probably it is a little bit so, because it's because all the sanctions that were applied to Russia, that Russia realized that it is a superpower. And even if it used to be a superpower during the Cold War, it has lost more or less this role, and now it's regaining its place, and it's re-emerging, I would say. That's the. But what is the position of Europe in that? I mean, they are losing ground in Asia, in the Middle East, in Africa, namely in the rest of the world. And we see no strategy to address that. We have no strategy or we see no strategy to restore the role of Europe in this confused world. Today, the role of Europe could be great in situations like, for instance, the Middle East. You have the US on one hand, you have the Middle East, I mean, Iran, Palestinians, and the Arab world on the other hand. Europe could play a great role in between those two, because everybody looks at the US when it comes to diplomacy in the Middle East. But the US is party to this conflict. So it cumulates the role of mediator and party to the conflict, a little bit like in Ukraine. There are some tricks of the Trump administration to say they are not party, because they say that was Biden administration. That was history. That's not my war. That's Biden's war. Now I'm trying to solve it. And in some way, this is also what they are doing with Iran. Although the crisis with Iran was largely started by Trump himself during his first mandate. But let's forget that. I mean, the new mandate is a new start for the US, and they play that, and that's the reason why they can assume both the role of party as a supporter, let's say, of Israel and so on, but at the same time try to mediate in the conflict with Iran and including the Palestinians to some extent. So we have this strange role of the US, and there is here a slot, in my view, for a power that has no imperialistic, or not directly imperialistic, views on the rest of the world, has lost his imperialist views, and could play a role based on fair diplomacy and fair trade. But it doesn't. So that's the European Union is totally absent for any crisis we are witnessing today. And then that means that the void here is filled by others. And that's the reason why we see Emmanuel Macron emerging, because this is a personality. He wants to show off. He wants to be in the center of the stage. And it's more, there is not much strategy. I mean, probably personal strategy, personal promotion strategy, but not so much, because he cannot speak for Europe. He can barely speak for France. So it's more like a personal, individual show than a real political commitment or a new role for France. France has no longer the means of such, let's say, a superpower, or let's say great power strategy. So we are orphan in Europe of objectives and strategies, and we see no one who is in a position to take over this role of leading a strategic view, or leading. And I don't know how to explain that in English, but there is something missing here, and we still tend to act tactically as we have done in the past 30 years, because there was no need to have strategies. Everything was going smooth, and therefore we didn't have the need, or we didn't feel the need for a strategy, even if I think we always need to have one, but okay. And we keep acting tactically without trying to have strategic views, strategic intents, and strategic paths to strategic objectives. So that's a little bit my view. And the problem we have today is that the US has strategic objectives, and they were clearly stated by the new president and his administration: make America great again. And we understand that everything that happens now tends to focus on that objectives, including the tariffs and all that. But we see at the same time that the application of these, or I mean, the path to this objective is very chaotic. It goes back and forth. We apply tariffs, and 2 days later, we come back. It's 2 step forward, 3 step backwards, meaning that there is no strategy. And that, I think, is the weakness of the West today. And the problem is that for the rest of the world, not just the BRICS, but also, I mean, China is part of the BRICS and Russia also. But for those countries, for the non-Western countries, they are in search of stability, stable trade relations, stable political relationships, stable, in fact, relationship at large. But because of this absence of strategy, this chaotic control of the situation, or not even control, it's not even a good word. It's a management, the chaotic management of the situation. People start to be a little bit afraid. And the only stable countries we see today are, in fact, China, Russia, India. These are the countries that show stable, how to say that, stable relations between themselves, first of all, but also a leadership that tends to be less chaotic, less tactical, more strategic, that thinks before acting, whereas in the West, it's acting before thinking. And we see that perfectly with everything that happened in relation to the settlement of the Ukraine crisis. So I would say the rest of the world has more trust now in countries such as China and Russia than in Western countries. And to complete the picture, we have, because of those erratic and chaotic decisions, we have an economy that starts weakening, both in the US and in Europe, making that foreign investors, and that includes actors that are a little bit, they don't directly belong to the West, but they are, and they don't belong to the rest of the world either, such as, for instance, Japan or South Korea, which are allies of the West, but are not completely or directly Western countries as such. And now these countries start being hesitating, continuing having trade relations with the West. And we see these trends of having Japan hesitating and reverting more and more towards China because it's a more stable partner in trade. I mean, the worst you can have when we make this for decision making in terms of trade, but also strategically, is instability. And that's exactly what those countries are looking for, is stability. And we probably have the same with other countries of the BRICS countries. They would prefer to have contacts with the non-Western countries. We see now we have, for instance, threats. The US policy now, and that's very interesting, by the way, that Trump is applying some kind of gunboat diplomacy to achieve its objective. So if you don't do what I want you to do, I will send the Navy, or I would apply sanctions or tariffs or whatever. This is not how you make international relations. But the fact that this is the way now the West is doing, and sanctioning has become probably the main foreign policy tools of the West at large, including my country, Switzerland, because as you may have seen last year, there was an article of the Washington Post about the effectiveness of sanctions, and they listed all the major sanctioning countries. And the first one was obviously the US, but the second one was Switzerland. And Switzerland is supposed to be a neutral country, but that illustrates perfectly the change that we have. People thinking tactically and not strategically. Because when you start as a neutral country to be a party to conflict, because using sanctions meaning that you're a party of a conflict, therefore you lose the trust that you need to be effective on the international stage.
Well, it does appear that in the post-Cold War era or the hegemonic era or unipolar era, whatever way one wants to term it, the strategic choices for the Europeans were quite well, they were laid in front. There was the US was aspiring for global primacy, so kind of Europe had the ideal of creating a unipolar moment around the political West instead, which would have two pillars, so the EU and the US. So try to have some parity with the Americans, but it created a very strange relationship. The problem is now that this unipolar order is over and the United States wants to reprioritize and go to other places. It's not clear what the Europeans can do. I mean, you mentioned Macron, and I think he's a good example of how they don't really know what to do. On one hand, he argued that there had to be a way of accommodating Russia in the European security architecture. Otherwise, all security would become zero-sum format, and we would have conflict. At the same time, he refuses to recognize that NATO has any role in this conflict as well, and that why shouldn't it expand? He also warned several times that Europe should not become vassals of America. Yet, he has joined in on this, this chanting that we have to cut relations with the Russians, now reduce ties with the Chinese, thus making ourselves more dependent only on the United States. A very asymmetrical partnership, by the way. And even in 2022, when there was diplomacy some diplomacy after Russia invaded between Macron and Putin, he warned other Europeans, if we don't talk to Russia, then a non-European power would have to negotiate peace in Europe after a while. And again, this is very correct. We see this now. The Americans, the Russians, they can't even have their peace meetings in Europe because Europe has become, we don't do diplomacy anymore, apparently. So it is a very strange position. We kind of have it both ways. And I was wondering how does this work for the unity of Europe? Because we keep saying Europe this and that, but Europe is a lot of countries with different interests, and one gets the impression that the foreign policies are beginning to diverge as well, not just with Hungary and Slovakia at the periphery, but you're seeing shifts now coming from places like Italy. Well, if I'm not mistaken, how do you see the unity of again, speaking about Europe as as Kissinger would say, the one phone number he could call. Did you see Europe becoming more fragmented, much like the political West in the years to come, if not months?
You see, I think the Ukrainian conflict has in fact revealed the weakness of the European dream, so to say, if I can call it a dream. But my personal view is that with the Maastricht Agreement, Europe went a bridge too far. Europe was initially designed in the early 50s as a trade organization. It was a way to facilitate trade among countries in order to help Europe to restore its industrial and economic power because of the threat of the Soviet Union. And that's also the reason why the US funded partly with the Marshall the Marshall Plan, that was this idea of strengthening Europe. And the first idea of Europe, which used to be called the common market, uh, was exactly that. It was to have kind of a trade organization. And I think that was the right thing to do, because then everybody can agree on improving trade conditions, and having barriers, I mean tariff barriers removed and all that, to facilitate the trade. Everybody can understand that. With Maastricht, we went a step further, and trying to have a common policy, a common foreign policy, common objectives, and what the conflict in Ukraine has revealed very blatantly is that you have a part of Europe that is still looking eastwards, while the rest of Europe, and namely what Donald Rumsfeld used to call the old Europe, is still looking westwards or southwards. When you're talking about Italy, Spain, Greece, these countries are Mediterranean countries. They have their traditional trade relationship with the south of the Mediterranean. They're very good relations. That's their area of interest, if you want. While if you listen to Kaya Kallas and Estonian politicians, it seems that their only focus or an area of interest is Russia. And they keep trying to provoke Russia, by the way. So we have here different worlds with different interests, and trying to bring all that under the same roof is probably not is not will not be successful. And that's exactly what we are witnessing today. And because of you have diverging interests. When you talk about Ukraine, for instance, the Hungarians, they have Hungarian minorities in Ukraine. They have complained for years, since 2014, that their Hungarian minorities in Ukraine was mistreated by the Ukrainians. So they addressed complaints to the Council of Europe and all that. But there were never any reply, because the enemy was Russia, not Ukraine. So nobody wanted to make any action against. So today, when we talk about, and since the very beginning of the conflict, by the way, or the Russian military intervention, Hungary refused to have weapons transiting on his territory towards Ukraine, because they say, well, they are mistreating our minorities here in Ukraine, and I should provide weapons for them. You see, so we see that these are diverging interests, and we see that more and more, because today you have additional issues that have become natural gas is certainly one. There are also other political interests. I mean, these countries that are bordering Ukraine want also to have stability. They used to have a relationship with Ukraine. They cannot have this situation where they don't know what will be tomorrow. So we see that the eastern part, and that's interesting, by the way. I mentioned the eastern part of Europe. When I was in NATO, I spent 5 years in NATO. I could feel, and my friends, other colonels of the NATO countries, mostly the old Europe countries, I mean, from France, Italy, or Germany, they felt exactly the same. Is that the policy of NATO is shaped around what the eastern part of Europe says. The Baltic states, despite the fact that they're very small, tiny, and all that, but they're extremely supportive to US policy. And as a result, they have not a stronger voice formally, but informally, they have a stronger weight in the decision making in NATO because they're extremely supportive to and not certainly not critical towards the US. While if you listen to old Europe militaries, they may have different nuanced view on with it. I mean, this remains extremely polite and all that. It's not that they're antagonizing US, but they may have diverging view. While on the eastern part of Europe, it will be always a yes, a massive yes to everything the US says. Therefore, the weight of these countries, and you see that in the European Union as well. I mean, the nomination of Kaja Kallas as foreign minister for the smallest country of the European Union, probably not the smallest, but one of the smallest country of the European Union, shows the weight of these countries into the overall decision making, and that contributes to the imbalance that we have within Europe. So my personal view is that if we continue on this path of deindustrialization, of this weakening of because when you talk about the weakening of the economy, you're also talking about the weakening of the social climate in the countries. And the more we'll go into that, the more we'll go into parties in country that want to be disconnected from the European Union. And that's what we see, for instance, with the AfD in Germany, but we see that in other parties in France. Um, and that might be because of the weakening of the whole Europe. We can have we're probably stepping back from what we wanted to achieve. I mean, these beautiful United States of Europe, which is, in my view, an objective which is unachievable because we are so different. You come from Norway, I come from Switzerland. We are certainly Norway and Switzerland have always had good relationships. I mean, basically, and we probably have very similar objectives. We probably have a lot in common, in fact, but we are not the same. We have different interests. Um, Formerly, I come from a neutral country, which
Or
is
really?
exactly, which is already a difference. But now, if we would have a Portuguese in that, I mean, yes, we all belong to Europe. Yes, we have a common ground and we have a part of our history in common. But we're also very different. We have different view on the world. The what the Germans call the Weltanschauung, so the perception of the world, is very different from one country to another. You come from a country which has access to the seas. So you're probably more open than we are. In Switzerland is a country which is closed between mountains, and we have this mentality. We have the mentality of our geography, which is, again, there is nothing good or bad in that. It's just a simple fact that we are different. And therefore, and my personal view is that those differences is in fact what make Europe great. And trying to melt all that into the same pot would be a mistake because we are rich of our diversity. We are rich of our diverse abilities, capabilities, diverse history, diverse experiences. And we can still talk together. We can still trade together. We can still have a fair and open relationship with others. I mean, Switzerland is doesn't belong to the European Union, but still has fair, and Norway is in the same situation, by the way, that we have fair relationship with our partner, so we don't need to have a European Union. And I think trying to force the way of this European Union with a supranational state that tries to make laws that fit everybody from the south of Portugal to the north of Finland, this just create tensions. And we see that on the labor market and all that, that at the end of the day, we are not improving situation. We are just exacerbating tensions. And if in addition to that, the benefits of being together is not to solve problems together, then what is the benefit of Europe? I mean, the way European Union managed the crisis in Ukraine or in Palestine is just the best example to show how Europe is useless.
Well, the basic idea was that Europe, we might have different interests, but somehow the values would be the common denominator that would unite. But I think, as you pointed out with the Hungarian example, is the values, instead of being something that's elevated above national interest, they become subordinated, mere slogans. So, for example, in Afghanistan, we cared a lot about human rights when it's legitimized the occupation, but once occupation is over, no one cares about Afghanistan anymore. And you get the same impression with Ukraine, by the way, that all these concerns for Ukrainians, it's always all the empathy is always weaponized to keep the war going. Empathy is never translated into peace initiatives effectively. So I think, yeah, as you said, from Gaza to Ukraine, and yeah, I don't see how the values are actually uniting. It becomes more instrumental, I think, to fuel power politics. And the political realists, they always say that institutions are only as effective and stable to the extent they reflect the actual distribution of power. And I think that has been the main challenge within these new constructions of Europe after the Cold War. That is, well, the only non-European European country today is Russia. That is the country with the largest territory, the largest population, the largest military, the largest economy in terms of purchasing power parity. And they're the only one who's not a part of Europe. And they don't have a seat at the table. Meanwhile, and with 145 million people. Meanwhile, Estonia with I think 1.3 million. Not only do they have a seat in table and should more of a say than Russia, but they also now represent the EU foreign policy chief. So yeah, we're having a previous prime minister of Estonia talking about breaking up the Russian Federation. It's just it's a bit yeah, crazy that this is how Europe has been put up.
It's a
Sorry.
militant Europe. Sorry to interrupt you. It's a militant Europe. I used to be active in the strategic intelligence during the Cold War, and we were somehow at war. I mean, it was a Cold War, but it was a war probably at the level of intelligence and things like this. It was not a hot war with weaponries and armies moving around. Well, it was more in the background to compete for a technology and other things and all that. Anyway, we were at war, but we were still talking to each other. We still had contacts with the Soviet counterparts. I remember when I used to be at the end of the 80s, as we started to implement those confidence building measures of the then CSC, we met Soviets, East Germans, and all that. We had fair discussions. We were smiling to each other. They were not considered as enemies, even if we were still formally into a Cold War. Well, you could buy the Pravda in every paper outlet in Switzerland or in Paris. You could buy those. Today they are banned. And
Well,
that shows that we have become militants and we have closed all the, let's say, communication paths to between each other. And I think that's a fantastic mistake. Even if we may have divergences, we may don't disagree on the various of topics. We may disagree on how to deal with Ukraine, but how come do we shut every door? That's what I don't understand. The first step to settle a problem is to talk, you
well, this is
know?
what the Europeans always told other countries around the world. If
Yeah.
there was a conflict, yes, the shooting might continue, but at least start talking. It doesn't cost anything, and if you can appreciate the opponent's view, you don't have to agree, but if you can understand it, then at least that's the first path to resolving it. This is why, for me, when we just stopped, shut down all diplomacy with the Russians, and instead just stood on the sideline and watching all these hundreds of thousands of young men die, and not only no one made excuses for it, it was hailed as a sign of our, moral righteousness that we didn't talk to the bad guys, and indeed, if we did, we would legitimize the Russians. So, and we would reward Putin by talking to him and rewarding his aggression. I mean, this is just it's well, I would like to say it's unheard of, but this has been the trend for for some time. But I want to ask about this recent development now with the Americans and the Ukrainians, because again, the US has said very openly that in this new multipolar world, Europe is no longer a priority, and they want to end the war in Ukraine, both to pull out of Ukraine, but also to pull out of Europe to some extent. And the Americans have also warned that if they can't reach an end to the war with a peace agreement, then they will simply wash their hands with it and call it a European war instead, and yeah, be done with it. But so the Europeans on their side, they do recognize more and more that the war has been lost, it's going the wrong way. They don't have the means to reverse this. They don't have any peace plan, an alternative peace plan, which would be better than the American one in terms of one that would could actually be implemented. Yet they oppose the American deal. Indeed, when Zelensky went out and said there's nothing to talk about, we don't even want to discuss Crimea, the Europeans, they just piled on. They said, yes, we as well, we will never accept that Crimea is Russian, even though nobody seriously believes that Crimea ever will be out of Russian hands again. So I can't make sense of this. This is again, if strategy is achieving the objective, the ends, and also taking into account the means to reach this end, uh, we can't reach the end. We don't have the means. I don't understand what the plan is here, though. Well, because if the alternative, we keep acting as if the alternative is no, we want all of Ukraine back and we want the NATO in Ukraine. But if the alternative is the complete destruction of Ukraine and the growing vulnerability of Europe, why aren't we jumping on this possible deal that the Americans are putting forth?
That's a very strange thing. Exactly what you said. I mean, the we understand that the ultimate goal of the Europeans would be to have the Russians back into the borders of 1991 and an absolute decisive victory of Ukraine. But all of us know that this will not be possible, that the situation that we have right now in Ukraine will not be reversed, and the positions and the territorial gains of Russia will not be reversed. And the Russians will not back on this. Uh, Crimea, there is also something that nobody mentions, but I think it's important to mention that Crimea, right before Ukraine became independent in 1991, uh, Crimea gained the status of autonomous region subordinated to Moscow. So it was detached from Ukraine and became subordinate to directly controlled by Moscow. And that was in January by referendum, the first referendum of autonomy in the Soviet Union, in fact, on the 20th of January 1991. And that was the first, that's the start of the Crimean crisis, in fact, because Ukraine never wanted, it became independent just months after that. And the Soviet Union disbanded in December 1991. In 1992, the Crimean constitution declared total independence, but Ukraine refused that. And in fact, Ukraine annexed, it toppled with special forces the president of Crimea. It abolished the constitution of Crimea, and it took over Crimea in 1995. And that became an object of contention between obviously Crimea and Ukraine, but also between Russia and Ukraine. But Russia refused to intervene into this conflict. And in 2014, as you had the Maidan events and all that, that resurrected the conflict. And Crimea made exactly the same referendum it made in 1991, and to join the Russian Federation. So for the Russians, it's absolutely clear that it's legitimate and legal. They never deployed any force. I mean, they didn't land into Crimea to take the country. That's also something that people tend to say the Russians came to invade Crimea and take it. No, they never did so. They never did so. You had troops stationed in Crimea based on the 2010 status of force agreement signed between Russia and Ukraine, allowing up to 25,000 soldiers, Russian soldiers, to be stationed on the peninsula. And when the problem started to erupt between the local population and the non-elected authorities of Ukraine in February 2014, then you started to have clashes, and the soldiers, the Russian soldiers, as per the status of force agreement, get out of their barracks in order to protect the installation, including the airports, because these were the lifeline with Russia, and this was, as per the status of force agreement, authorized for the Russians to take position in those places. And that's what the Russians did. At one point, when the clashes between the authorities and the local population became so severe, Vladimir Putin authorized the Russian soldiers to enforce order, in fact. And that's what they did. And that was absolutely according that, again, this law enforcement role of the Russian soldiers was allowed by the status of force agreement. And at the same time, the Ukrainian forces, at that time you had 22,000 Ukrainian soldiers stationed in Crimea. Out of these 22,000, 20,000 defected to the Russians. And they took off their insignia and they became the so-called little green men. These were not Russian. Anyway, so that means that the Russians will not give up with that. The Russians will not give up the 4 region. Why? Because of the law of the 1st July 2021 that gives different rights to the Russians as to the ordinary or the other Ukrainians. There was this law on the indigenous people that make a difference based on ethnicity, and for that reason, that's part of the denazification objective that was stated by Vladimir Putin in February 2022. As part of this objective, the Russians will not return those oblasts to Ukraine. So we have a situation in which obviously the Russians will not move back from what they have and what they have decided, because obviously they claim, or they wanted, better said, that the entirety of the four region be under Russian control, meaning that the Ukraine should leave those areas, plus the issue of NATO. So the Russians will not move back from that. And as of today, they have the means to maintain and to gain further territories in order to achieve their goal. Period. Now, the Europeans, the Ukrainians, I think, have realized this. And the Americans have realized this as well. And that's the reason why even Witkoff tries to find a midway by suggesting or proposing that the Russians keep just what they have for the four region and not the entirety of the four oblasts, which is a trick basically just to have the Ukrainians on board. But for the Russians, it's very clear they are here to protect the Russian population, and therefore they will not go back from this request or this demand, having the entirety of the four region under their control, period. And the problem is that since we have seen this situation developing, because this is not new, we have seen that developing since 2023, in fact, the Europeans have never thought about a plan B to solve the situation. They have no strategy to address that. And they still keep exactly the same narrative about Crimea, about the four region, about everything, including NATO. The and that's the disappointing part of it, because we see that despite this idea of bringing new troops, they have absolutely developed no other proposal, no alternative plan, no alternative solution for anyone. And there are not many, in fact. There are not many. But they are still relying on the US to make proposals. They could have tried to do something. They could have tried to press or make pressure on Zelensky to achieve a better result. Remember that in 2000, in 2022, after the or during the Istanbul discussions, the idea was that the Russians would leave the country. That was part of the deal, with the status of the two Republic of Donbass and Crimea to be discussed later. But the idea of this agreement was, in essence, Ukraine would remain neutral, I mean, not part of NATO, and the Russians would withdraw to the Russian borders. That was the idea, meaning that the Russians, by the way, never tried to occupy Ukraine or to take over Ukraine, as it was said in the European narrative. They were ready to leave. But then you had not just Boris Johnson, you have also two actors that nobody mentioned. That was Germany and France. Germany and France asked then the Russians, as sign of goodwill, to withdraw their troops from the area of Kiev. And that's the reason why, because the negotiations were on the right path, and the Russians were confident, and in fact, the Ukrainian part signed the proposal they made. So the Russians were confident that an agreement could be reached, and therefore, as a sign of goodwill, they withdrew their troops from Kiev area up to the Kharkov area. That's the reason. And that was on the request of the Germans and the French. And as soon as the Russians have left Kiev, then Boris Johnson came and everything was forgotten and we started the war again. So we see that the role of the West in that has been systematically not to find a solution to the conflict, but to fight against Russia. And that's exactly what we are witnessing today. In fact, we are witnessing the result today that there is no solution for the conflict. There are only solutions or ideas that we can defeat Russia. By the way, in the situation we have today, the Europeans have never defined what could be a victory of Ukraine or what could be a defeat of Russia. What could be defined as a victory? Now, probably some people you have seen Wesley Clark, the US general, saying that it will be a defeat of Russia if they don't reach Odessa or things like this. But this is just some imaginary type of solution. We are not able in the current situation to define what we want to achieve. And we are back to the discussion we had before, that there are no objectives. We have never defined an objective which is achievable. We can say, of course, that Russia should withdraw up to the Ural. Okay, we can say that. But this is obviously not achievable. And for that reason, when you don't have an objective, how can you elaborate a strategy to achieve that objective? And we are exactly in that situation. But again, this is the whole issue of how we understand the conflict. And the Europeans have never tried to understand the conflict as it is, but based on their narrative. The narrative has become the centerpiece of the Western strategy. The problem is that today the narrative collides with the reality, and therefore we cannot base our strategy on the narrative. We have to rely on the reality, and that's a problem.
This is again strategy. If the objective is to defeat the world's largest nuclear power, who considers this to be an existential threat, one has to challenge the ends, but also the means. That we don't have the means, and just on the narratives though, it was an interesting comment made by Alexei Arestovich, the former advisor of Zelensky, made the point that this narrative has been like a huge tanker, just been saying the same thing over and over again. And if now that the war is being lost, our work should be on changing the narratives, preparing the public and the political system for painful concessions. But this takes a while to turn a tank around. But if you want to turn it around, you have to first recognize that the invasion wasn't unprovoked. It wasn't simply an effort to restore the Soviet Union. And also, if you can't talk about what happened in Istanbul, because the Russians were willing to take all the troops back in return for neutrality for Ukraine, which shows that this war was all about NATO and not about territory. So I think as long as the Europeans can't even have this discussion, I don't think there's any hope of reviving strategic thinking. Anyways, Colonel Baud, thank you so much for your time. It's always great to speak with you.
That was sorry, I talk a lot. I'm sorry
Oh
about
no,
that,
it's
but this is we need very often to come back to the roots. The same as okay, I probably have no time, but the issue of what you just said that it's about NATO, yes and no. The whole issue is about how Ukraine understands how it can belong to NATO or not. That's the key point, in fact. And that explains why you had these initiatives of the Russians on the 17th of December 2021. They could have done the much before because since 2008 we know that Ukraine could be member of NATO. But they have decided to do that in 2021 because they were sensing that this idea of belonging to NATO was the driving force for Ukraine to start an operation in the Donbass, as explained Alexei Arestovich in 2019. And that's exactly the reason why, just before the Ukrainians launched the operation, they decided that the Russians tried to make clear for the Ukrainians that they will not belong to NATO. That, and if you read the papers that they have written, you see that almost written explicitly. And that's exactly the reason why, even today, everybody has said to the Ukrainians they will not belong to NATO. But it is still a demand from Zelensky, meaning that they still have not accepted this idea that they will not belong to NATO. And that was exactly what, in fact, started or explained the action of Ukraine in the very beginning of 2022. Sorry, I was a little bit long,
No,
but it's very important to understand
it
that,
is.
because there is a very fine-tuned mechanic here that nobody really understands. But if you look at the timelines, if you look exactly at one point, everybody said, why, for instance, the Russians, in those two documents that I mentioned before in December, they come back to 1997. And in fact, they refer to the 27th of May, 1997. Why that? Because that's the first document that was signed in the framework of the NATO-Russia Council when it was created. And that's a document in which NATO acknowledges a principle that has been acknowledged in various documents of the United Nations and the OSCE about the indivisibility of security. And that's exactly the reason why it's 1997 and not another date. And so we have to understand that, because again, what comes back and on the table every day, it's the root causes of the conflict. And to go to the root causes, we have to go deeper, as we tend to do, even in the West, even those who are well intentioned towards the Russians or whoever. And we have to go deeper in the analysis of that to understand exactly why the Russians came, what they had in mind, and what the Ukrainians also had in mind. Sorry, but here I made a little bit too long, but sorry
No,
to
it is fascinating. So again, thanks. Yeah, now I could speak with you for hours. So thanks again. Appreciate it.
Thank you very
Have a good
much.
one.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye bye. Thank you.